Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. Thank you so much for joining EVC Leadership Immersion. This morning, we have Ideas 42 with combating employee breakout. They will be hosting us this morning, and I'm going to go ahead and send it over to Ashley, and she's going to get us started for a moment.
All right. Sorry, let me do something really quick. All right. Let me know if you see my screen moving. Yes, right? Okay, wonderful. All right. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today. We're very excited to chat about combating employee burnout with you all and kind of talk about some behavioral design that can be implemented to address burnout and lower employee morale. We're super excited to chat and just hear about your perspective and your experiences as well. Now, before we get started, we know that many of you have actually attended our workshops in the past, and I actually remember a few faces here, so it's very nice to see you all again. But for those of you who don't know us, Ideas 42 is a nonprofit that uses behavioral science and psychology to tackle challenging social problems. So what this means is that we focus on reducing behavioral barriers to make it easier for people to pursue and achieve their goals. Now, surprise, surprise, workers are more stressed than ever before. I mean, who could have guessed it, right? We know that having high employee morale is an essential for doing this work well. But according to Gallup's State of the Global Workplace 2022 report, 44% of employees experienced a lot of daily stress in the previous day. And while almost half of the world's workers felt the burden of the stress, working women in the United States and in Canada were amongst the most stressed employees globally. And this is going to be an important fact that's going to come up again during Anna Vig's session. Now, a bit of stress is actually a normal part of our daily lives, and it can actually even be good for us. Overcoming stressful events can make us more resilient, enhance our motivation, and even promote bonding, to name a few. But when the stress becomes chronic, meaning that it's persistent and recurring, it can have a huge impact on our brains. Work-related stressors can have psychological and physical influences. So, for example, long work hours have been linked to significantly higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Work-related stress can lead to changes in modulating mood and cognition, which can lead to depression. And work-home spillover, something that we'll discuss shortly, has been negatively linked to sleep quality, energy, exhaustion, and psychological distress levels. Now, this work-life spillover has actually been associated with lower employee job satisfaction, high levels of absenteeism and turnover, poor health qualities, and family conflict. And what this means is that it worsens conditions, not only for employees within the workplace, but also outside of it. And burnout is a significant problem, and we understand that. We know that this workshop alone isn't going to solve burnout, and it's definitely not going to relieve or alleviate your fatigue. We're also not going to tell you to take bubble baths or get more sleep or do yoga. But instead, what we're here to do or help is create systems and structures that can proactively address that or prevent worker burnout. And this can be done by making regular work feel more manageable, designing systems that can actually adapt to crises, and strengthening resilience and encouraging recharge. All right, now with all that being said, let me walk you through a quick agenda for the day. So first, we'll start off with an introduction to applied behavioral science. I think some of you heard a little bit about it during the last workshop. We'll kind of run through it a little more so today. Then we'll move on to making the expected easier, or a section that Anna Vig will actually run through and discuss strategies on how to improve burnout in existing work. Then we'll move on to activity 1 and come back for managing the unexpected. And here, Vivian will talk about how to reduce work when unplanned tasks come up. Then we'll move on to promoting resilience, and then we'll close out with activity 2. And throughout the workshop, we'll have moments where you all can ask questions or drop any of your concerns and chats or ideas in the chat box. All right, so moving on to tackling goal 1, learning about behavioral and applied behavioral science. So at Ideas 42, when we look at decision-making and behavior, we break it down into 3 separate components. The first one is people's intentions, or what they want to do, right? And this could look like people signing up for a program or saying that they're interested in one. Or it could also be them talking about their goals of saving money and finding a new job. Now, secondly, we have actions, or what people actually do. And this is often what we as external audiences can see. Did they come to the program or the session they signed up for? Did they save money over time, or did they apply for jobs? But it's important to remember that intentions don't always equal actions. And this is largely because of a third component of behavior known as context. Now, this is a broad term that covers a large array of features and factors in people's environments. These can include physical spaces like the existence of an escalator, or it can reference social environments. What are people saying? What are they doing? Or it can be about financial circumstances. And even things like our sense of self, our mood, or the time of day are part of our context. And we know that being in situations of financial stress or other kinds of scarcity can actually affect the way that we make decisions and take actions. And at Ideas 42, we focus on context in particular for 2 reasons. First, context is often overlooked when people think about behavior. So instead of us thinking about the context in which people exist in, we often tend to blame folks for not doing X, Y, or Z as part of their personality or characteristics. So for example, if someone doesn't go to the gym, you might call that individual or perceive them to be lazy. But the reality is that context plays an important role in shaping people's behavior. This person may have missed the gym because they had to work overtime, or maybe they share a car with someone and they couldn't find a ride at the most convenient time. Now, the second reason that we focus on context is because we actually create context for our clients all the time. And this can be anywhere from sign-up processes to forms to one-on-one interactions and communications. And this means that we can directly change people's context by changing parts of our organization's communications or processes. And these changes, in turn, can lead to form clearer intentions and then turn those intentions into actions. Now, before we jump into actually redesign communications or talking about strategies on how to address burnout, we want to introduce a few common psychologies that interact with workplace context. Specifically, we're going to dive into identity and self-perception, social norms, and cognitive bandwidth. So for the purpose of this workshop, we're going to define identity and self-perception as our desire to act in alignment with the identities that we hold. We humans have many identities. Some of you here might be sisters, friends, excellent workers, mentors, superheroes, you name it. But because we spend so much of our time at work, that may become our primary or most highly valued identity. And as I just mentioned, we tend to act in accordance or associate ourselves with that identity. We tend to leverage behaviors that are associated with that identity. And so our identities as professionals that seek to help the community or work with the community means that you might have to be selfless or put your needs after your client's needs. And so we act in accordance with this identity, even when we know that it affects our well-being. And similarly to caring about what we think about ourselves, we also care about what others think about us and how they act in a certain space. And this is a phenomenon that we reference as social norm. So in the context of work, it can be especially helpful to think about the differing motivations for the ways that we act. What do we do because it aligns with how we see ourselves? And what do we do because it aligns with how our colleagues or our coworkers act and how we perceive them? So for instance, I may stay late at work because I view myself as an overachiever or a hard worker. But I may also stay late at work because this is what I see my coworkers or my colleagues doing. And in that case, I'm being impacted by the social norms in my workplace. So the behavior of others is really important for two reasons. One, as we discussed, it can greatly influence our own behavior, encouraging us to act as others do. And oftentimes, this can actually make it easier for us to comply or fit into a space when we're unsure how to behave within it. But social norms can also affect our perceptions of ourselves. So if we are unable to act how others are acting in a certain space, we might begin to feel inadequate. So if all of your colleagues are working late and you're unable to, it may lead you to question whether or not you're cut out for that job. And this matters because social norms can really perpetuate behavior that fuels burnout and dampens our employee morale. And this is especially true for people who feel like their identities don't fit into a workplace. And this is because chronic stress may ensue from acting in conflict with your identity to fit in, or from going against the grain and acting differently than the prescribed norms of your workplace. Now, the third psychology we want to share with you all is actually cognitive bandwidth. And this is an incredibly important principle when we're talking about stress and burnout. Our cognitive bandwidth is our capacity to absorb and process relevant information. And our cognitive power fuels our daily lives and allows us to do everything from think through problems, focus our attention, to taking others' perspective in and really sitting with it. But unfortunately, there are a lot of aspects of our work that can tax or otherwise reduce our cognitive bandwidth. And these might include suffering from decision fatigue, facing hassle factors, and being in situations of scarcity or just not having enough resources. Now, we want to quickly dive into what each of these mean. So decision fatigue refers to the deteriorating quality of decisions made by an individual after a long session of decision making. Essentially, after making many decisions, your ability to make new decisions over the course of a day just get increasingly worse. And this is because your self-control is being taxed by each decision that you're making. And this can happen in any aspects of our lives, both within and outside the workplace. So one popular example to think about is the idea of uniforms leveraged by Steve Jobs. So every single day, he wears a black t-shirt and jeans, and this is for the purpose of eliminating an additional decision point. Now, next we have hassle factors. And hassle factors are the inconveniences or obstacles that impede from acting out on a desired behavior. And this is because the effort that it takes to complete an action or prevent us from following through, no matter how small or large. Now, to be more precise, hassles are small frictions or steps that need to be taken in order to complete an action. So you can think about filling out forms, waiting in line, having to find a stamp, or even copying down a URL link. And this is because it creates additional choices, decisions, actions that we need to take in a process in order to get that action completed. Now, under scarcity, hassle factors have an even greater potential than usual to halt the completion of a desired action. So a requirement to print out paperwork in advance of a meeting or even to call in to make up an appointment is enough to actually prompt procrastination and avoidance. And it's important to pay close attention to hassle factors because they can easily tip the scale towards inaction, especially when someone is focused on the present and is low on bandwidth. And finally, the third component we want to talk about is scarcity, or the chronic state of not having enough of something. Now, for this workshop, scarcity exists in situations where people do not have enough resources, such as time, people, money, or other things necessary to get the work done and go about their daily lives. And importantly, cognitive bandwidth is a resource just like time and money. But what makes it unique is that it is directly affected by scarcity and other resources. So what we see is that the managing of scarcity of one resource, money, for example, might require a lot of trade-off thinking and prioritization about how to make that money stretch. So you might ask yourself, can I afford this? Should I pay off this bill? Or should I pay off my rent? And that trade-off thinking uses up your cognitive bandwidth. And this is true for other resources such as time. Figuring out how to spend your finite time can also tax your cognitive bandwidth. And this mental work is a widespread experience, meaning that anyone, when stressed out for money, time, or any other resource, experiences a tax on their cognitive bandwidth. And scarcity has all other types of effects on our behavior. So when our bandwidth is taxed by scarcity, we do something that's called tunneling, or we fixate on whatever we lack. And in the short term, tunneling can actually be quite adaptive. So if you think back to the last time you had a deadline, maybe that's the only thing that you focused on in that moment. And because you were so focused on it, you actually achieved or completed the task by the deadline. However, just because tunneling is adaptive doesn't mean that it's trivial or without consequences. So perhaps in an effort to meet that deadline, you forgot about other obligations. Maybe you stayed up late, or maybe you skipped a meal. And that's the effect of a tunnel. Now, let's quickly look at an example of what these consequences could look like by examining one study on the impacts of chronic scarcity. So a few years ago, researchers recruited a group of shoppers in a New Jersey mall and divided them into two separate groups. Now, both of these groups were presented with a car accident scenario. One group, however, was told that repairs would cost them $150, while another group was told that they'd have to pay $1,500 to fix up their car. And then participants were told to think about what they would do in that situation. And afterwards, participants were given a test that allowed researchers to measure their mental processing or available cognitive bandwidth in that moment. And they did so by using come and puzzle problems like this one. But what did they find? So if we take a look at the shoppers above the median income, you can see that their performance on the cognitive aptitude test was pretty much the same in either scenario. Now, if we look at the people making below 55K who read the lower scenario, so the 151, again, you see that they performed about the same. And this tells us that people perform quite similarly, basically across income levels, when they're not bandwidth constrained. But the troubling part is that when people who earned below the median income were asked to think about what they would do if they had to fork over $1,500, they saw a major drop in cognitive capacity. And to put this into context, this is worse than losing a whole night's sleep. So what this study shows is that even just thinking about a hypothetical stressful scenario is enough to prompt that tax on our mental bandwidth. So as you can see, being in a context of scarcity, no matter what is causing it, affects our ability to make decisions and to act. Now, before we talk about how to manage the stress and implement them into our work, we really quickly want to summarize what we've covered so far. So first, our identity and self-perceptions influence the actions that we take. In particular, we take actions that align with our perceived identity, even when it might cause us some harm. Secondly, the behaviors of others or something called social norms may pressure us to act accordingly. So we may feel inadequate if we stray from these accepted norms or act differently from them. And finally, our ability to process information, pay attention, and make decisions is called our cognitive bandwidth. And this bandwidth can be depleted when we experience moments of scarcity or situations where we just lack resources. Now, we know that this was a lot of information, so we wanted to take a quick pause and see if anybody had any questions before we head into the strategies.
I have a quick one.
Yeah.
So my assumption is that a lot of this information is based on folks who are neurotypical. I'm wondering if you guys have looked at all into sort of the impact it has when you add another layer of neurodivergence.
Vivian, do you want to?
I'm also one of the breakfast eaters, so
Sorry.
My bad.
No, a lot of this research is like done. Well, it's not done in a sense of like it's filtering for neurotypical folks. But most likely most people, I think, yeah, we should assume either most of the people in this research are neurotypical or that there's like a standard distribution of sort of neurodivergence within the group, because
Okay.
like the shoppers, they didn't ask, right? And they didn't filter for it, so it didn't come up. Some of the like studies are more likely to be just neurotypical folks, but I think we could either assume weighted towards neurotypical or like a standard sort of distribution of neurodivergence.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
I would also add that, and this is like an assumption because like I said, I don't know what the research on neurodivergent folks might be like, but there might be different things that, affect neurodivergent folks differently. But I do think that things like cognitive bandwidth, for instance, and the fact that having like a scarcity in terms of like resources, those things usually play the same role, right? It might be what resources are scarce change depending on whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent and how those happen in your workspace. But generally being, mentally taxed is going to have a negative effect on people.
Definitely. I think my question more or less was turned towards the fact that like that cognitive bandwidth, as a person who's neurodivergent, I find that, and again, this is probably diving down into the rabbit hole, but for someone, I use this example a lot, when someone thinks about doing the laundry, they think, wash the laundry, dry the laundry, fold the laundry, right? And those are 3 steps. For someone who's neurodivergent, it's okay, I have to go everywhere and find all the clothes. I have to separate them into. So the decision fatigue, I think, is almost tripled for someone who's neurodivergent. So that mental bandwidth, and we call it mental load in our house, like it is definitely something that is tripled, sometimes even quadrupled, when it comes to that sort of taxation.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, like I know that there's the part of the internet I'm on, people talk a lot about spoon theory. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's like, yeah, go ahead.
Yep.
It's like, I think it's primarily for folks who have fatigue and pain. And the idea is like, if you want to think about like how much, like folks with chronic pain have like 6 spoons, and it takes a spoon to do laundry. And like once that spoon's gone, I don't exactly remember the details of it, but it's a similar idea, right? We have a limited set of resources, and different things are draining for different people. And to your point, like if you're neurodivergent, some things will be more draining. And so the idea with this workshop is like, let's figure out ways we can remove some drain. And for some people, it'll be more helpful. For other people, it'll be less helpful. Yeah, we're not taking the sort of like a neurodivergent lens at all.
Yeah, no worries. I legitimately just wondering about the study, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
Do we have any more questions or should I move on to my section, Ashley?
I just want to recognize what Maya said in the chat. Also, if I mispronounce your name, please feel free to correct me. They said, so employees experiencing their own challenges with scarcity or cognitive bandwidth in their personal lives, that's not something we have control over. So how do we make considerations for that spillover, lowering their bandwidth at work? Okay, Vivian, I see that you responded. But yeah, I definitely think that we're like, thank you for posting that in the chat and mentioning it in the chat. It's definitely important. And I think that's kind of what Anna Vic and Vivian are going to get into when they talk about strategies a little bit. I think it's going to be focused vastly on work, but we'll definitely be talking about personal lives and how work-life spillover is a very real and valid challenge. So Anna Vic, maybe I can hand it over with you.
Yeah. Absolutely. Let me see. Let me know what you guys can see.
Yeah, you're good.
All good? Okay, now let me fix my own screen. All right, awesome. So thank you so much, Ashley. And like Ashley was mentioning, I am going to move us a little bit into strategies for boosting morale and combating burnout in the work that we have, and that is planned work. So we're going to go over 3 strategies. It's divided into these 3 sections that you see on screen. And we're going to start with the first one, which is making the expected easier. And so as members of a team, of course, we want everyone to successfully complete all of their required responsibilities. But unfortunately, even a typical workload can sometimes feel really impossible to accomplish for a multitude of reasons, which can include you not having enough time in a day, for instance, or it's hard to determine what to prioritize, or you might even feel like you're only able to complete your tasks if you don't take breaks or if you work longer hours. Now, research shows that there's actually a few behavioral barriers that could be contributing to us feeling like I just mentioned. And the first one is called planning fallacy, which means that we often underestimate how long things will take. So in practice, this might mean that we agree to work on something in the future because we're underestimating how long the task at hand will actually take us. And so then, of course, and I'm sure that this has happened to many of us, when tomorrow rolls around, we are stuck with way more work than we can reasonably handle and often have to work overtime. And planning fallacy is, I just want to emphasize, it's something that happens to all of us. It's a big reason why projects are frequently delayed or need to get extended, or why we're, frankly, burnt out. So planning fallacy is something that we actually need to work around, because it is a sort of human thing that occurs. And the second behavioral barrier that gets in the way is limited attention. We all have limited attention, especially in terms of the amount of mental bandwidth that we have. So this can affect our work because it can make it really hard to focus on your tasks, especially when you have so many other things to do floating around in your head. It also means that we might agree to work on things, not remembering that we had already committed to something else, or that we're fully booked within that time frame. So today, we are going to go over the 6 strategies that you see listed here, and they are aimed at streamlining work. I believe if you haven't yet already received a worksheet, this will also be in the worksheet that is emailed to you or that has already been emailed to you. We are going to start with these first 2, which are creating a plan and planning for missteps. And these 2 strategies are specifically aimed at accounting for the behavioral barrier I mentioned in the last slide, which is planning fallacy, and the other one, which is limited attention. Okay, so the first strategy for making the expected easier is to create a plan. And you'll want to start by unpacking the task. Unpacking the task is really just a breakdown that involves identifying all of the small sub-steps that you'll need to complete that task. So as an example, let's imagine that you're inviting clients to your office for an event. If you're just thinking about that abstractly, you might think, oh, that's easy. I don't need much time for that. But thinking so abstractly, you might not plan for the fact that every guest must be registered within the front desk, so that you need to print out a list ahead of time and get that list to the security guard. Or, for example, that sometimes the tables and the chairs in the room that you're going to use get rearranged the night before by other coworkers. And so breaking down the task into sub-steps is helpful because we often overlook some of these components, which then leads us to not setting aside enough time to fully prepare or fully complete the work. Now, once you know everything that needs to happen, then you can decide when, where, and how you're going to complete each of the steps. And when you do this, it's always helpful to also account for what could go wrong. So again, in that example, imagine that you're setting up for an event. For instance, you should assume or could assume, or it's good to assume, that the furniture, the tables, and the chairs did get moved around the night before, and so that you'll need to come in a bit earlier to move everything back into position. And so here are some examples of prompts that you can go through to unpack a task and think through when to complete things. So again, just going over a little bit what I said. So what do I need to complete in the next day? If you want to look a little bit further ahead in the future, then what do I need to complete in the next week? What specific steps do I need to complete? The when, where, and how will I complete them? And then going over what could go wrong while I'm completing them. What should be considerations in that regard. And you can also share these prompts with colleagues. Like we mentioned earlier, we're usually working as part of a team. So it's good to share this with colleagues so that when they're thinking about how much time to allot, they can do so accordingly. Okay, now in terms of allotting time, one helpful tip is to schedule each step of your plan in your calendars. And this ensures that you have time to execute your plans, but also increases the likelihood that you'll complete steps because you've set a specific intention. And adding things into your calendar also helps avoid overcommitting. So let's imagine that this is my schedule for next week. If you see what I have on screen here, it looks like I have a team meeting in the morning. Then I'm hosting that in-person client event in the afternoon. But when my calendar looks like this, it can really feel like I have quite a bit of time in Slack. When in reality, I'm doing a lot of other work, right? So maybe I shouldn't volunteer to take something else on, or my manager shouldn't really invite me to that optional, quote unquote, optional meeting. And it also becomes really clear that I'm working a lot of hours. So we recommend making this kind of scheduling a sort of org-wide practice for two reasons. The first is that it helps managers understand what their team's workload is like, what is taking a lot of their team's time, and then it can also foster more thoughtful scheduling and management practices. So like I mentioned earlier, you also want to plan in a way that assumes missteps will happen. So assume you'll get distracted and that things will come up. So two key tips in this regard. First, set reminders and make sure that they're detailed enough. So a reminder that just says something like email clients is quite vague, and you might not remember what you're supposed to email them about. Versus something like, email clients about upcoming event and remind them to complete pre-event documents. The latter one, of course, makes sure that you don't forget the important points that you're emailing them about. Now, the second thing you can do is create a checklist for yourself. So thinking back to that example about setting up an event, that's a task that has a lot of small steps. So instead of holding all that information in your head, you could write out a checklist for yourself to make sure that you remember to bring all of the materials for the event. And it's also helpful because by making these steps visible, you can also share that checklist with your team and make sure that they're kind of aligned and also know what's going on. So another thing you'll want to do is assume, like I mentioned earlier, planning fallacy, assume that you'll need more time than you actually think you need. So we often recommend scheduling 50% more time than you think. And if you're new to the task, you might want to increase that amount. Assume it'll take maybe double or triple the expected time, the expected amount of time. And I mean, it obviously makes sense. When you're new, you're still learning the ropes. So things that, might be a little bit shorter for someone else might take a little bit longer for you. Okay, so these strategies that we just went over emphasize planning, which I know and I recognize can feel like we're saying, if only you had planned things better, you would have finished everything. But better planning isn't a panacea. We also need to manage our and others' cognitive bandwidth, like Ashley was saying earlier, to make sure that the team's bandwidth is not overtaxed. And it turns out that how our work is structured can unnecessarily tax our bandwidth. So for example, if you are working on many tasks, especially unrelated tasks, it might be taxing to switch between them. Now, having to make a lot of decisions can also burn through your mental bandwidth. And finally, as can be having to deal with a multitude of hassle factors, which are not just frustrating, but also very mentally taxing. And I just want a little nod to what Stacy said earlier, right? If making a lot of decisions can burn through our mental bandwidth, then maybe somebody who's neurodivergent, who, has significantly more decisions to make within a given task, again, that mental bandwidth is even more easily taxed for them. And so what can we do? So the first thing, as with many of the things that I'll share today, it starts by assessing your team's bandwidth. So laying things out, right? So first, review everyone's workload and determine whether responsibilities are distributed effectively and equitably. And, I know there's a lot of ways to think about how to equitably distribute work. So this is not an all-encompassing statement, but rather focused on equity in terms of bandwidth and making sure that no one's bandwidth is more taxed than anyone else's. And when doing so, it is always helpful to think about two key aspects. Like I mentioned earlier, task switching and quantity of decisions. That way, when you're reviewing your team's workloads, you can think about how to distribute tasks so that not one person is excessively task switching or overburdened with a bunch of the decisions. Now, when it comes to decisions in particular, there's a few things you can do. The first thing is thinking about redistributing decisions so that not one person, like I said, is tasked with making all of them. Now, when redistribution is not possible, you can use things like decision aids to instead reduce the number of decisions altogether. This one on the screen is called the Eisenhower matrix. I think it's also in your handout, and it's a really common decision aid for helping people decide which tasks to focus on right now, which can be deferred, delegated, or deleted altogether if you're short on time. Now, there are also rules of thumb, which are quick tools that you can create for specific situations, taking the choice out altogether. So for example, a rule of thumb would be do deep work from 9 to 11 and call clients from 12 to 2. Now, another thing that can drain your bandwidth is anxiety. And research shows that offering help can make people feel less anxious, even if they don't end up taking up that help. So remember to make help salient and accessible, and remind peers and colleagues that they can ask for help and that questions are common, expected, and welcome. And again, this is even if they don't end up using that help. Now, dealing with hassles can deplete people's bandwidth, but they also do lead to wasted time. So you want to try to remove them as much as possible. So to find hassles, you'll want to start with a map out, basically, and examining organizational and even individual processes. And then you'll want to find the hassles in the process. So hassles can look like what I have here on screen. So maybe processes that have very many steps, steps that require engaging with different people or going to different places. When there's a particular step that could derail the whole process, or steps where you might be underestimating the difficulty or complexity of that given step. This is just a couple of examples. Of course, there's other ways in which hassles can show up, but the ones listed here are quite common. So as an example, think about the task of filing expenses. You might think, oh, that's pretty simple. But for any of us that have filed expenses, I hate filing expenses in particular, but a lot goes into filing them. And you start to see that only when you build out a process map. And so you can see here, this is a process map of what it might look to file an expense. And the first thing you can see is that there's a lot of steps within this process itself. And a lot of steps also means that there are plenty of opportunities to forget or to fail to act. So for example, someone might forget to save a receipt. You might find it difficult to figure out how long to set aside for a task like this. Someone might forget or not to file by a particular deadline, or it might be difficult to figure out how to fill in the expense forms. Now, with a process like this one of the best things you can do is a complete overhaul. So for example, if you have the resources, automating the expensing process altogether, or providing company cards that directly upload to an online system. And if you do something like that, here's, you might see here's how much simpler the process map becomes if you do. But we, of course, recognize that these overhauls aren't always possible. So simplifying and removing individual steps can really, really go a long way. I just want to emphasize that because we do recognize that, truly, sometimes there's not resources or no time to just completely redo a process. But really, small things can have a really big impact. So determining which are the main hassles and finding ways to circumvent them or minimize them is, can go a really long way. Sorry, I skipped forward. Okay, so we've so far been talking about strategies that you can implement so that you and others can have a more manageable workload. Now, for anyone running projects, meetings, there's also additional strategies that you can implement to improve not just how you manage your time, but other people's time. So, what are the behavioral barriers that we are trying to mitigate when we're changing how we manage other people's time? The first one is that we tend to be risk averse, which means that we tend to avoid risk and prefer options with more certain outcomes. And this can lead to something maybe all of you, if not most, are familiar with, which is over collaboration. So how so? Imagine, for example, that you don't include someone in a meeting. There's a risk that they need to be involved in that decision or that they might feel disrespected by not being included. So if you are fully risk averse, you might end up inviting every single person to every single meeting, as opposed to thinking, who really has to be in this meeting? Now, the second one is fundamental attribution error, which means we tend to attribute other people's behaviors to who they are rather than as an outcome of their situation. Ashley, I think you mentioned this briefly before. So for example, if somebody doesn't go to the gym, you might assume that they're lazy, when in reality, there could be a bunch of contextual reasons why they didn't go to the gym. So for example, when someone is frequently late to meetings, so applying the same thing in a work context, you might think that they don't care about the work or that they're lazy. And that makes you feel like you have to be involved in everything. Instead, we should consider their circumstances. So perhaps they have children and the regular meeting times bump up against the time they drop off their kids. Or you can imagine that they live in an older home with thick walls that gives them internet connectivity issues. So, when you keep these two things in mind, you might start realizing these are reasons that we tend to over collaborate and that we often ask more of people's time and involvement than is necessary for the team's success. So how do we minimize unproductive time commitments? So first, let's start with how meetings are managed. So one thing to do is to write and share meeting agendas in advance. So for example, you see here on screen, there's a meeting here that has program check-in, approximate time that it'll take, the sort of points that will be discussed. And then there's a little note here, Joe and Marley can leave when you get to the survey progress discussion. So what this is an example of is a well-structured agenda that not only outlines what you're going to talk about, but also who is expected to contribute and what outcomes you hope to accomplish. So by planning your agendas in advance, you might find that you only need to include certain people for certain discussion items or two, like Joe and Marley, and that after those items are addressed, they can be dismissed. Which brings up a second recommendation. Making meeting topics discrete can make it easier to segment who needs to be on at a given time. So instead of blending everything together, which forces people to sit through the entire meeting, you can free up people's time, again, by just chunking the meeting into specific subjects. Another more aggressive tactic is to make meetings shorter than you think they need to be. So for example, if your regular team meeting is 60 minutes, experiment shortening it to 30 minutes. I know this can sound kind of scary, but this will force you to consider only raising the points that absolutely must be addressed in real time. And then you can think about transitioning some other things to email or to smaller conversations. That brings me to our last recommendation, which is to replace meetings with emails. Planning meetings in the way we're recommending may help you realize that a meeting or topic could be accomplished over email, that emails are also a great way to address risk aversion. So rather than including everyone just in case, you could send out that email about plans and then ask folks to respond if they're interested in joining or in being involved. And you can also disseminate notes after meetings so that everyone can stay in the loop without needing to be in every single meeting. Okay, so this might all sound well and good, and these strategies hopefully feel, relatively manageable. But it's also important to acknowledge that organization-wide adoption is crucial to really helping manage folks' bandwidth. So we wanted to note a few strategies that can encourage sort of wider adoption of these things I'm bringing up in these practices that I've been sharing with y'all. The first one, pretty straightforward. You want to lead by example. Leaders and managers especially should be highlighting when they are implementing these strategies, such as making their calendars public. Remember when I showed you in the other slide, a calendar with a bunch of different things that you needed to do in the subtasks. So if you're going to implement that, verbally express or create a written communication that says we're doing this, and then also do it yourself so that people reviewing and revising your calendar can see what you have to do, and then you can also revise the team's workload. Now, second, you could create some norms about how work works essentially at the organization and publicizing those so that people know. At our org, for example, there's no meeting Fridays. And then finally, if you're a manager or leader, you'll want to recognize when people are doing things to make theirs and other workloads more manageable. So little props here and there when people do actually follow these strategies that you've set forth. I am going to go ahead and pause before we hop into these group discussions. I wanted to see if anybody had any questions.
Not a question, but just to confirm the setting of norms, we have no meeting Mondays instead of no meeting Fridays because we don't work on Fridays, but we have no meeting Mondays because we feel like it gets rid of the Sunday scaries when you come to work on Monday and that you don't have any meetings scheduled. So it has been a huge morale booster. Now, not everybody follows it, but in our department, we do our best to stick to it as best as possible. So
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. The Sunday scaries part I didn't even think about, but it's so true. But also, I feel like every time you start a week, you have so much planning to do at the beginning of the week for the rest of your week, which I feel like nobody recognizes. And it's so nice to not have meetings that day, to just actually work plan the rest of your week.
Exactly.
Also.
That's exactly, honestly, it allows us. So we have, the way we structured is we have no meeting Mondays, and then our team meetings are on Wednesdays. That way you have Monday to plan and do any work that was left over the following week without feeling like, oh my gosh, I had all this left at the end of the week. Now I have to get this done, but I also have to figure out what's going on today. But then on Wednesday, we have our team meetings so that we can, by Wednesday, we understand where are we on things? What am I behind on? What do I need help with? What is my bandwidth? And then the next day is Thursday, which is technically our Friday. And we have that day to sort of close out the week. So it really is just this nice flow to things. And our team has given one of the things we've implemented that has been by far the biggest positive feedback is no meeting Mondays and then team meetings on Wednesdays.
I love that. You're literally driving us into the discussion, because that's kind of what we wanted to talk about a little bit, is just whether there's strategies that you're currently implementing or strategies that you might want to implement, or areas where you see opportunities for some of this stuff to be applied. So it sounds like in your team, you have these norms that are going, it's cool, I think, that you're saying that you have noticed a shift in employee morale, right? They're not just mentally useful, it's they're actually boosting the team's desire, I suppose, to work, or well-being at work. So that's cool to hear too, to get that feedback from, the people working there too. I'm gonna open it up to both questions, but also put the discussion slide up. Vivian and Ashley, we might just run the discussion here with. Okay, great. So I think we can. How much do we have for discussion time? Sorry, you guys remind me.
10 minutes. So
10?
Yeah.
Awesome. Is there anyone else, or Stacy, even if you want to go again, but in general, of the folks here, anybody else want to share some, strategies related to what I just talked about, or if there's other things that you're seeing or thinking about processes-wise that you might want to sort of reassess, given what we talked about, mental bandwidth, hassles, decision fatigue. If there's anything that's sticking out to you about your current practices that you might want to tailor, and maybe how.
I have more, but I'll pause and let other folks share so I don't take over.
Yes, this is Antonio. Thank you, Anna. That have been all that information very useful. I just was thinking, because it's a lot of information at the same time to apply them. There are tools, for example, when distributing the workload in a team, it's sometimes very hard and difficult, even when you have given some guide here. And I was wondering if there are some tools on the play book has some tool that we can use. For example, for projects, we use the logic model, when you can put what is the outcome and the task and where, when. But sometimes it's hard for some people to use some of the tool. And I was wondering if you have in the playbook some simple tool that we can use for some of the example, like distributing the task, for example.
Yeah. So one of the ones, first and foremost, I think Vivian, you might later in your session talk a little bit more about certain planning tools in terms of breaking out steps and how to think about them. And she'll talk more about this. I don't want to but pre-mortems and post-mortems, and she'll give a little bit more examples around tools. We have that Eisenhower matrix, which is one that can be helpful when thinking about decisions and how to prioritize them. And then this is something completely unrelated. Well, it's not completely unrelated, but it's something really cool that I was reading. I think it was yesterday randomly. And it was about how, leaders and people in positions of power in an organization, they might go into a meeting and give feedback, not realizing how their feedback is taken. And so sometimes somebody might go back and completely redo their work because the manager said, oh, I wish this button had been a different color. Right? But that was a very, very minor feedback that shouldn't have been basically sometimes what you say you might not know the consequences of having said it. And so this CEO from this company says that he started breaking down the sort of feedback that he gave into different types. So there were 3. There was personal opinion. This one means either decide to change the color or not. Totally up to you. The person in charge of the task can determine it. Then the second one was strong suggestion. And then the third one was mandate. And I think that even something like that, by making that a practice, you can remove, you might remove the additional work that you're creating for some other people that you might not even realize you're creating, right?
Yeah.
Which I thought was interesting. Something like change the color of a button shouldn't mean that all of a sudden your engineering team has to go back and spend the next 3 days fixing this. It was just something said as a comment. And so I think even things like that can help people determine what is work they need to do, which isn't. Yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yes, that type of tool can be very helpful and interactive with others. Yes, thank you.
And unfortunately, the actual resource doesn't have a ton of specific tools, partially because this is meant to be a broad workshop. We run it with people who do very desk-oriented work. We'll do it with people who are on the phone all day, right? Different kinds of jobs actually will require different tools and different people, or different people will require different tools even. So we don't have a ton in there that's here's the tool to use, but instead look for things that are like this, that help you try to do this, and then sort of finding the tools that work for your teams.
Okay, thank you.
Stacy, you could go ahead.
Okay, cool. So two things. One thing that we had done sort of unintentionally, but then made it very intentional after some feedback from the team was human check-ins. We always start our meetings with the very first meeting agenda as a human check-in, and we dedicate 10 minutes to that. And that's really, and we will either have a question already on hand if folks don't just like automatically jump in, or we will just let folks jump in and share, and then we'll go based off of whoever jumps in and shares first. Clearly, from who I am, our team is very talkative. We're all very similar. So rarely do we not have something to share. So that was one big thing. The other thing was, and this took time, which I think is very important. It took time, and it took people with different skills working on it together, because I am very freely open with the fact that I am neurodivergent, which means that details mean nothing to me. I am like the big picture person. I am the future person. But when it comes to how do we implement it, that is not my strong suit. So I use a structure that I've sort of deemed myself. My team's like, you have to write this up, which is doers, strategizers, and organizers. I'm a strategizer. I can think of all the strategy in the world, but it's going to take somebody to then organize those thoughts into like an SOP. And then it's going to take somebody who's a doer to actually get in there and structure it and set it up. And so we took about 4 months. We had 3 different virtual and in-person team retreats, going through what did we like, what didn't we like, what were areas that we were struggling with. And then we sat down as a leadership team and said, okay, here's what we're going to try and implement. And so we implemented things like all of our agendas are in a project management system. So we use Asana, but you could use, heck, you could even use Google Sheets if you wanted to. But like everybody has access to all of the agendas, and we take any notes. The notes get attached to that agenda. So you're not having to be like, oh, what file is it saved in? No, everything gets automatically saved there. We check off the stuff as we talk about it. That way we can see like, what did we not cover? And we just move it to the next one. And all of our agendas are saved into one project. And the projects are what the different meetings are. So our team meeting, our leadership meeting, our one-on-ones. And so that it's sort of very nice and neatly formulated. But then we can also go back and look at what have folks been assigned? What did we miss? What did we shift? We use the assignment tool. So we assign it to somebody. So it's never just living out there in the ether. But again, it took time. And that was one thing that we had to all agree to, was that it wasn't going to be perfect right out the gate. And that when we did the implementation, not everybody was going to love it right out the gate. But it's now been a year. And I think if we tried to change it back to what it was, our staff would revolt because everybody loves it. We all know where stuff is at. We created, we have a share drive. We created naming mechanisms so that we all know what we're looking for. It's all the same structure. And it did take, there was pushback in the beginning, but now everybody loves it. So it really is sort of about that. Other folks in the organization are like, oh, can you send us your SOPs? And we're like, no, not because we want to gatekeep, but because we took the time to talk to our team to figure this out. And this is what works for us. You need to go through that process too. You can't just pick up somebody else's process because they're doing it well and think that your team's going to do it well. So that's my little bit of feedback.
I love that. Thanks for sharing. I am curious. I don't know how much time do we have left?
0. 30 seconds.
Okay. No. I was just gonna. What did you say, Vivian?
30 seconds.
Oh no. I was just gonna ask Stacey a follow-up, but we can always do that at the end if we have more time. I'll stop sharing, Vivian, so you can take over.
All right. So I'm going to be walking us through the two last sets of strategies. Anna Vic talked about strategies to help sort of manage your workload and other people's workloads so that it doesn't overflow. But now we're going to switch to focusing on how to manage problems, crises, or other unexpected events. And one thing you'll notice is that many of the strategies are an overlay to the strategies that Anna Vick shared. So they're add-ons, because managing the unexpected is a sort of new type of work, but it's nonetheless sort of managing work that exists. Okay, so let's start off with, why is it so challenging to manage unexpected events? Well, first, as we mentioned, we have a finite amount of attention, so we can only pay attention to so much at once, which affects us on a day-to-day, but it becomes especially evident when we're dealing with something unexpected. Then you add on to that, that in stressful situations, we're likely to be doing something called tunneling, which Ashley explained earlier. Basically, we're focusing just on the issue that came up at the expense of everything else, even if everything else is equally or more important. On top of that, responding to a crisis can be time-consuming and exhausting, which then further leads to mistakes and more stress. So how do we navigate unexpected events and crises given all this? Well, first, people just need to have available time and energy to navigate these moments, which is why a lot of what Anna Vick was talking about was reducing burden, reducing effort, reducing the things that are taxing. But then once people have that sort of energy available to navigate the unexpected, we then need to make the crises themselves less cognitively taxing, so that you're not then overusing energy to navigate them. So one thing you can do is called a pre-mortem, which is a tool that helps teams think through problems that might come up and also to plan for potential issues. And Anna Vick did mention sort of just like when you're breaking a task down for yourself, think about what could go wrong and sort of plan around that. A pre-mortem has similar goals, but it's focused on the larger issues and also a team, right? It's not just about your individual task necessarily, but what could go wrong on a larger level, and then how can the team work around that? So these things are fairly simple, and you'll see an example on the screen. So the first thing you want to do is just brainstorm what kinds of issues might come up in an initiative, program, or whatever you're planning for. And you'll see here we have AV equipment glitches during our client event as the failure. But then you don't actually want to stop there, right? You want to assume, as Anna Vick said, that something is going to go wrong, because it does. Even though sort of the first step here is to, plan, like, how do we prevent this from happening, right? That's the first step. But then you want to go further and you want to think about, what would be an early sign that this problem is still happening? If we see those early signs, what are we going to do? And then who's in charge, who's responsible for that? And then the idea is that you go through any big challenges or any big failures that you expect and just have this simple, clear plan in place. And the idea is then, if something goes wrong with AV, there's no conversation, right? Jessica knows exactly what she needs to do. She knows what she needs to look for, and then she takes her steps. So it sort of means there's no figuring out in the moment, right? It's all already planned out. Now, obviously, this is not a sort of like plan for every single possible scenario. You want to plan around the things that seem very likely, like an AV glitch, or very big and important. But something that's like our partner just shuts down, that's enormous, but it's also so unlikely to happen that it's not worth doing this kind of planning. So there's a sweet spot here. This is not planned for everything, but instead have a set of plans for if things go wrong. Then adding on to this idea of blocking off time in your calendar. When you're doing that, we also recommend explicitly setting aside time that is not assigned to anything, right? This is Slack time, it's catch-up time. That way, when problems arise, you can either use this time to reschedule meetings or to, accomplish tasks that you had to defer. And if no issues come up, then you can use this time to get ahead, right? We all always have things that we're not getting done. So you will have things to fill this time with. And if you don't, maybe you need, people need the time. Now, creating Slack like this is tough, right? As professionals sort of in the world we're in as it is today, we often feel like we need to be constantly working to prove our worth. But ironically, without Slack, we're actually less productive and we're more likely to miss deadlines and make mistakes. So there's this tension where people feel like they need to pack their schedule. And so because of it, it's especially crucial to really set an explicit norm of this is how we work and make it clear to people how to make it happen and really reinforce it over time. Because otherwise that norm of like, you always have to be working is gonna overwhelm, right? It's gonna be the main thing driving people and they're not gonna create slack for themselves. Okay, the last strategy we'll talk about are two things that specifically managers and project leads can do when a crisis is happening, right? A crisis happened, you are the lead. One of the things you want to do is make sure that whatever important tasks there are in your work that are not relevant to the crisis, you want to make sure that they don't get lost, right? So you can do this through resources, checklists, reminders, but basically as the lead, you want to think about, okay, my team is dealing with this fire. They're likely going to forget about their day-to-day tasks that are crucial to keep going. So I'm going to be the support in that case, and I'm going to remind them. Maybe I'll help figure out how to make space for it, because you want to imagine and assume that they're tunneling on the crisis at hand. The other thing you can do are build in backstops, which, like Slack, basically tries to lessen the impact of issues when they do happen. So as an example, if you're planning, say, an in-person event, the way to build in a backstop there is to identify more team members than you think you'll need for facilitation purposes or for just making sure participants are where they need to be. That way, if day of one of your staff members are sick, you have people lined up to take over that role. And if nobody's sick, then those people can sort of go back to their work, right? There's no sort of harm and no foul. And we actually have a real life example of that, which is that I was the backstop for this workshop. I was not supposed to present, but then the person who was going to be presenting these two sections wasn't able to be here today. So here we are, right? It took some time, right? I had to make sure to keep this time set aside. I had to make sure to set aside time in case anything happened. But that's a mild inconvenience compared to, not having that prepared so that I had to scramble or not having anyone to present at all. So you have a live example of a backstop today. Okay, so to summarize this general section, if you want to help employees better manage the unexpected, first, you want to help them make plans that prevent issues from happening in the first place, but also think about if these are going to happen, what will we do? And thinking about those, especially for high likelihood, high sort of like value, very impactful problems. You also want to make sure people are creating Slack to absorb unexpected issues. And then you want to provide supports and create backstops. That way, when things happen, it's not a panic. It doesn't drain people. It's not morale draining. It ends up being part of sort of the job in general. Okay. Then this is our last section, which is about helping teams adopt a more resilient mindset and also promoting their ability to rest and recharge. And to kick this section off, I want to put a reminder out there into the world that the work you all do is important, right? You're working hard to create and run products or programs that help people achieve their goals or that help improve people's quality of life. And that on its own is something to be really proud of. And we need to hold two things at the same time, right? This is important work and it's challenging. It can be stressful. It can feel thankless. It can be never ending, right? The list goes on and on about what's challenging with nonprofit work. So why is this the case, right? Even though we're doing important work, having all this work or having difficult work can eliminate the fact that this is important or motivating work. Well, first, there's the fact that we fall prey to something called negativity bias. Basically, we notice negative things more frequently and with more severity. So as an example, let's say you had 2 interactions on Friday. One went really well. It was friendly, positive, productive. And the other one went terribly, right? The conversation was tense, emotions got heated, nothing was resolved. Even though both of those things happened, the negative one is going to weigh on your mind, right? That's the one you're going to remember and think about. And it's because of negativity bias. Those negative events just weigh more heavily. Then to make matters worse, we tend to perceive our behavior, feelings, and actions as sort of part of who we are, even when circumstances played a significant role in what we ended up doing. So as an example, you could think about, if the work you were doing with a client has stalled, right? They're not making progress anymore, or maybe every client you work with, everybody's stalled, or all your projects aren't working out for some reason. And if you think about that moment, right? Does it mean you're bad at your job if all your clients have stalled or all your projects aren't working out? Does it mean you don't care? Not necessarily, right? Like maybe for some people, but actually lots of other things can explain why your whole sort of like suite of clients are stalled, right? Maybe someone recently quit and you have extra clients, or a funding stream got cut, or you're suddenly being asked to do an extra layer of bureaucracy or incorporate a new tool that you're not familiar with, right? Of course, things are going to stall if any of those things happen. You're just one person. And with nonprofit work in particular, there's always going to be a lot of external stuff not in our control that's affecting how effective and impactful our work is, or even just feels, right? Sometimes our work is impactful, but it doesn't feel like it for whatever reason. So what does this all mean from work? Well, essentially, when everything starts to feel negative and you begin to blame yourself for the stress and issues that you and your team face, you can start to question, right? Is this sector really for me? Is this organization a good fit? When in reality, these biases are actually distorting how you experience things, and these biases are affecting your morale. So it's not actually that a bunch of negative stuff is happening and you're terrible at your job. It's that you're remembering the negative things more, right? Or sort of you're only thinking about the ways in which you are impacting the outcomes, as opposed to realizing there's a lot of complicated stuff happening and your work is still valuable and meaningful. Okay, so what can we do about this? Conveniently, negativity bias can be addressed via positivity. So as an example, and I'm sure many of you have heard or done this, just reminding yourself or other people of past successes or skills that you or other people have can go a long way, right? Remembering that, I'm good at this. I've done this in the past. You've done this in the past. Or reminding people of their strengths, right? In moments where things are going awry, reminding people like, you're really good at navigating this kind of stuff. You're good at this. Like, this is actually the best moment to have you involved, because while everything's going awry, we know you have the skill set for it. And one other thing you can do if you sort of have control over who works on what is make sure that folks have work that you know they enjoy and will excel at, because the sense of accomplishment in one sort of task or stream of work will affect how they approach other harder work, because they're getting that sort of like affirmative boost. And then, of course, recognizing and affirming folks privately and in public can also really sort of boost this. Next, part of building your team's resilience does involve helping people understand what true success is and not just idealized success looks like, right? Success isn't and cannot be just constantly hitting your metrics. We need to, in our workplaces, redefine that success isn't sort of being perfect, right? Success is overcoming obstacles, navigating challenges, learning, bringing in support when you need it. And there's lots of ways to do this, whether it's by creating sort of group moments to discuss things, whether it's just constantly reinforcing it through communications and messaging and norms, but really highlighting that change and adversity is expected in this work, and that not everything is in our control, right? Failure isn't necessary. Failure, something not working at work, doesn't mean you did a bad job. It might mean other things. And that can go a long way in sort of helping people de-anchor and like sort of from failure as their problem, and instead something that they're navigating together. Now, I want to go back to something I mentioned earlier, which is rest is just as crucial as any part of our work. And one of the best ways to prevent burnout is to take time off to recharge and disconnect from work. I'm saying that, I'm not saying the only reason one should rest is to be more productive, right? We should all rest because rest is deserved and we don't need to earn it. And in the workplace, often the way people think is in terms of productivity. So it's helpful to frame rest in terms of the ways in which it does affect work. Now, unfortunately, actually doing this, actually taking time off and disconnecting can be really difficult. The trend is that people feel like they have to work long hours, they can't take long vacations, and they have to sacrifice their personal lives for their jobs. But we're all worse off in many different ways when we do that. And there are many factors that contribute to this, right? There's structural issues like organizations discouraging employees from taking leave. But some people might feel like taking time off makes them selfish, right? And that doesn't align with who they are. And this can be especially true in small teams where one person taking off work means someone else has to do extra work. Some people might also be risk averse, right? And hesitant to step away if they, fear that it might negatively impact their work or their clients, or if they fear facing judgment from their team members. And lastly, if we don't see other people taking time off, we probably are going to assume that it's unacceptable, right? That it's not a thing people do here. So, what can we do? Well, sort of like hooking back to the redefining success. When you're redefining success, one thing that's really important is going to be highlighting that taking time off is part of being successful. And then leaders, managers, and anybody who has sort of a longer tenure at any organization will play a really crucial role here in illustrating that unplugging is approved and encouraged, right? This includes doing it yourself, right? Leading by example. Also communicating norms like our team does not work on weekends except when we host events. And also developing really clear rules of thumb. When you're on PTO, you're not expected to answer emails, texts, or messages. Maybe these things feel like they're a given, but it's actually important to not treat them as a given because you never really know what work experiences that people might be coming from that might lead them to believe that like, oh no, they say like, don't check your email during vacation, but you're supposed to. And something that's not on the screen, but for anybody who has a job themselves or whose teams have jobs that very easily bleed into personal lives, like if you have people who can call you at any point in the day, at any day of the week, one thing you can do to really highlight the norm is give employees standard language that they can use to respond to clients when they approach them. This both makes it easier for me as an employee, as a person in my day-to-day life, right? To like respond and not feel bad, not feel guilty, not have spent a bunch of energy trying to figure it out. But also the fact that you're giving the language really reinforces you are not expected to, work with clients on your off time. You also want to find ways to make it clearly evident that people are taking time off. Ashley talked about social norms earlier. We really are influenced by what other people are doing. So first, just make it transparent that PTO is happening for that reason. But also, this can help with planning, right? If you can see when people are going to be away, you can prepare and plan around that and make sure the workflow makes sense based on who's off. And if you're a leader or a manager, seeing people's PTO can help you notice, is someone never taking time off? Or are there people who only ever take 2-3 days off and never take off a week or two? When you see those sort of moments, that's when you can send those reminders to folks, right? And say, hey, everybody should be taking time off at some point this year. Have you sat down to think about it? Have you sat down to plan it? You should plan it because it helps us do better if you tell us when you're taking time off. Now, another reason people might not take vacation is because they might just not understand how to take time off, or they don't want to go through the hassle of sort of preparing and doing that work. And if you think about someone who's already hesitant to take time off or isn't sure if it's okay, or who's already stressed about like, how am I going to get all my work done and take this time off? A lack of clarity around how to get that time off can keep those people from following through, right? Because it's like, oh, I'm so stressed out about how to get all this done. And like, I don't even understand how to take time off. So you know what, whatever, I'm not doing it. Now, policies aren't always in your control. So obviously if you can change them, great. if you can't, you can come up with other things like one-pagers, checklists, guides, to really help set people up to figure out how to navigate that process. Then another thing that can get in the way of taking time off that I sort of alluded to is just figuring out how is the work going to continue while you're gone, right? That's almost like a second job, right? What's all the stuff I do? What needs to happen while I'm gone, etc. So it can be really effective to create supports around this, to encourage people to do this, but also to make it easier. And this could be, you know, some clear prompts to answer that will just guide people through thinking through everything, right? Could be as simple as, I'm taking time off on these dates. During my timeout, these tasks still need to happen by these dates. And the people responsible for each task are, and then you just add a little thing there. And you can even add a premortem, right? Here are the things that might go wrong. Here's who to turn to if it does. And then you want to, you can add in a little like, I respect and support decisions that are made while I'm out. So like, don't bother, right? Like, you guys come up with a solution, I will respect it, and there's no need to bring me in. And one thing I want to highlight, especially if you're a leader or manager, is that you want to really prompt people to identify what work of theirs can stop while they're gone, so that one person being gone doesn't always mean someone else taking up their work. Otherwise, there's always the sense of like the work must go on. But if you're a manager or a leader, like, you have that perspective to know, like, nope, things can stop. And so encouraging folks to think about what's going to stop, what's just like not going to keep happening, and creating that space. Okay, so I see that I have not been reading any of the chats, but let me just recap here, and then we can see if there's questions or discussion. So we can help team members stay engaged and passionate by, you know, priming positive identities, reminding people that they're like good at their job, they have skills, they're valuable, that like what's happening isn't about them. Also redefining and reinforcing realistic standards of success that include things like taking time off. And then, you know, providing supports to help folks understand and navigate policies, but also to really plan to take time off and create that space for themselves so they can truly and entirely disconnect. Okay. Let me see. Are there any chats that are worth discussing?
Stacy shared some strategies, but I think they're all in reference to kind of the tactics that you talked about. So no questions necessary.
Well, did anybody have any questions about anything? There's just, wait, it's just two of you? It's just Gina and Stacy? All right.
Yes, I'm here. And I'm still here.
Awesome. Okay, so we have one last activity. There's just the two of you, so we can figure out how we want to do it. But we can, but also, since this can be your time too, if there's things you'd prefer to discuss, if, for example, Gina, if there's stuff you're hearing Stacy talk about that you feel like you'd want to try to incorporate, it can become like a, hey, how did you do that kind of conversation. It does not need to include us. Or Stacy, if there's things that you have in mind or you want to brainstorm or think about. The activity, the activity that we had for this portion is to sort of find out what strategies other people have already implemented, and then just sort of hear tips from each other and discuss like things you're interested in trying out, how to actually even get there, right? Like, how do I get my team to do no meeting Mondays? So that's what we have for the rest of, let me check my, stop sharing screen. I don't think it's that useful. Yeah, that's what we have for the rest of the time, is just questions and sort of discussing strategies that you all already use or want to use.
Hello.
Yeah.
I appreciate all the content, but I highlight the schedule, the work that you do personally, because in my schedule only appear the meetings or other things that we are together, but
Yeah.
then the process, the setting all this stuff for the meetings or for the other things that you do in group, I don't register this time, and it's so much time. And you think you have time, but then at the end of the day, you said, oh my God, the time is gone. And
Yeah.
I didn't anything really important. Yes,
Yeah.
it's the thought at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I love to the advice or the tip to do not put meeting on Mondays. Is for me is a good idea because Monday is Monday. You are so little dizzy or overwhelming that all the things that you have to do or you didn't from the last week.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel like, because I know that like for us, we use our calendars a lot. And so like it's very easy to integrate that. For you, do you feel like putting stuff on a calendar like that is going to help, or is that a whole new set of things you have to even start doing to use that strategy?
For me, it's very useful because
Yeah.
I work in the same time, in the same way. This kind of work to put all the activities in the calendar have me to be in order or um, have a list or have an account all that I are doing. I don't know if you understand that I'm trying to say. Yes, for me it's useful. I think in my case, in my organization, not all the people have the same method or way, and it's, I think, will be better if all have the register or the tracking of this time, because it's better for the team work.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I guess is sort of what Stacy had talked about earlier, that it's like a lot of work to get everybody on the same system. And that's never how it starts, right? Nobody ever is on the same system unless you force everybody to.
I don't know, at the beginning, maybe Monday is a good day to put all this in order.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, you think it's a lot of work because you don't have the habit to do.
Yeah.
But then it's easy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That actually happened with us at our own org with Asana, Vivian, and Anna Vic. We suddenly shifted to like a project managing software, I guess, Asana, because we had been using like Google Excel sheets. And I think, kind of precisely to what Stacy was saying earlier, it was like difficult to find information, or like it just took extra steps to actually find it, versus now you go on Asana, you do 2 clicks and then you're there. And I think it was like kind of a pain to remember to check off a task or like to input a task or whatever it be into the system. But it's like you said, once you get going, then like it makes the work a lot more effective and efficient. And I think to the meetings piece, one of the things that I've actually seen modeled by Vivian, who's my supervisor, is that there's like some days where they're like much more meeting heavy, right? And so you have meeting after meeting after meeting. And ahead of time, if I realize that I have like more than 4 meetings in a day, I automatically block off at least an hour, and where I just write like DNS, like do not schedule, no meetings at this time. And I can either leverage that for like my own personal work, or sometimes even for like lunch, because other times you can't even take a break to actually eat. And I don't know how feasible that is at your organization, Gina, but I think that's one way to maybe address the fact that like there are so many meetings, and that sometimes folks just like over schedule, I guess.
So the whole lunch thing, I have to definitely like jump in on this, because that is where my Achilles heel is. So as part of our team requirements, we we have told, and so I am definitely that leader that models. I think I told you guys this before, like I am the quintessential millennial like manager. And so like I said, we love bomb folks who are in, they're supposed to be off, or like if I call you and you sound ill, I'm gonna hound you until you agree to take time off, even if it's me having to say like, you worked 3 hours, so you get to go, quote, see the doctor for 2 hours, and you don't have to take time off to go see the doctor. So I play the rules a little bit. So we can delete that from the recording. But the lunch thing is where I tend to fall off myself, and it's not because I don't believe in lunches or anything like that. Talking about that sort of mental taxing, I work from home, which is both a blessing and a curse. My office is on the 3rd floor, my kitchen's on the 1st floor. So it requires me to physically get up and go down 2 flights of stairs to make food. If I don't already have food planned out, then I have used so much energy convincing myself to go downstairs and eat that by the time I get to the refrigerator, I open it up and I'm like, there's nothing here to eat. Now the fridge is full of things and I'm sure that I could put something together, but I just don't have the mental capacity for it, right? And so I have lunches blocked out on my calendar. Everybody on our team is required to block off at least a half an hour. We encourage an hour for lunch. But actually that quote unquote meeting gets moved more often than any other meeting on my calendar. And it is mostly because I ignore it. Like I have 2 different reminders. I have, and to your point, breakfast may be one of the best meals of the day, but if you eat breakfast and then you don't eat again until 8 p.m., that's not good. So that is my one thing that I have not quite figured out yet, how to get myself to eat. And like I'll go through those periods where it's like, I'm going to meal plan and I'm going to have the salad bar in my refrigerator, and it's great for like a week. And then the salad bar goes bad and I'm just like, this was a waste of money. I'm never doing this again. And then I go back to my bad habits. And I really loved on TikTok when they coined girl dinner, because that is what I have on a consistent basis for many meals except for breakfast. So again, nothing of like positive note to add to that, but I will say that the lunch is where my Achilles heel is every single time.
Yeah, the thing so we often talk about like as managers and leaders navigating this down. I do actually think it's also important to do this up, like in the sense of, so Stacey, your story about breaking the rules reminded me of the like covert things I do, which include when our boss is terrible at taking time off. She'll say she's on time off and then she's taking a bunch of meetings or answering emails or whatever. I have in the past emailed or texted everybody in our team and said, Evelyn is off today. Nobody sent her a message. Because if one of you sends her a message, she's going to want to make your life easy. She's going to want to make sure you guys feel supported, and she's going to answer, and then she's not actually going to take time off. And if she's overwhelmed and if she doesn't feel like she can take the time, like, right, like that overwhelm kind of like drips down in a way that's kind of invisible and it's not necessarily clear. But I think it goes like both ways too, of like and I think this lunch thing also, I don't know if I'm able to take like the half hour unless I have like just meetings. And the thing I found that helps a lot, which is kind of like a little bit of a culture thing and a little bit of a like maybe privilege of our job, is I'm like, what's the worst that's going to happen if I'm not paying attention for half an hour, right? Like really nothing. I know that if you work in like foster care or other things, like there is this is not a relevant strategy. But I found that like having like my boss being like, I have to walk the dogs, and like there's no option there, right? She has to, and what's the worst that's going to happen sort of like trickles down. But that's like a mental strategy shift I've had in like the past 2 years of like, what's the worst that's going to happen?
I think that's interesting, Vivian, because I think that to me, it's not that much that people are going to die if I'm not available for 40 minutes or whatever. To me, it's that I think similar to Stacey is that I get to the kitchen and I have so many things in my brain that I'm like, I don't want to make food. Like I can't even think about what's in my fridge and how to put it together. And I just don't want to. Like this is too mentally taxing right now. Like And I think meal prepping works, but the problem with meal prepping is that it's also mentally taxing. You have to think about what you're going to meal prep the week before, which, you know, probably on a Sunday when you're already tired and you know that you're about to go to work on Monday. So it's like, I don't know, it's like that's a hard one because it's not necessarily about moving away from the computer. It's about like, I just don't want to make food. I have too much stuff going on in my brain. And I don't know, like one thing I do, Stacey, and I don't know if like this works for you, is I just have like a bunch of fruit and I literally just have it in a Tupperware and I'll just bring it upstairs and like just have it there because I don't have to prepare it. I don't have to do anything. It just goes down because it's fruit. But I am also very bad at eating lunch. Like lunch is a meal that I consistently skip.
So here's my thing, right? I am a productive procrastinator, right? I don't know if that's a real thing, but that's a term that I've used for a very long time. And so I'll go down and I'll be like, you know what? I'm throwing a load of laundry. So I'll go throw in the load of laundry while I think about what I'm going to have for lunch. And then that'll turn into, again, we're describing ADHD tendencies. That'll turn into like, oh, well, I need to like let the dog out to go to the bathroom. Okay, well, I'm outside, so I need to take the trash out.
I
right?
need to water the 3 plants in my house right now for
Right.
no reason at all.
That I've been neglecting for a month, but now all of a sudden they must be watered, right? Like that is my biggest issue. What I have found, and this is where, like, this is one of those things where, like, you know what you're, quote, supposed to do, right? And the shoulds and the whatnots, like, it is very simple to understand. Get a protein, get a vegetable, get a carb, consume it, right? But the actual implementation of that is so challenging. So I try to convince myself that it is okay if I eat like a toddler. Like that is one of those like brain shifts that I'm trying very hard in this new year to be like, if I want to create a charcuterie board, which again, loving TikTok, depressed it's going away potentially, is just the reason why I'm hyper focused on charcuterie boards is because I was one of those kids that had the oh gosh, what was like the tear and had the meat and the cheese and the crackers, you know what I'm talking
Vegetables,
about.
right?
Yes, exactly. So yes, I'm like, why can't I not go back to having adult Lunchables? And I just have cheese. I have crackers. Now the meat's challenge, I think, because I don't eat meat, but like smoked fish is the thing that I can throw in there. But I'm like, I don't have to create full meals. And so like, I also don't have to shame myself when I crack open a can of refried beans and I throw some cheese on that. Like that's protein. Like, but I find myself shaming myself for that. And then I won't eat it. Right. Because that's the real, we're talking about like the burnout piece is our own internal worst critic is I get burned out for stuff like that because I'm like, no, this is not what I'm supposed to be doing. So sorry, I went down a whole different rabbit hole with that one, but like that is my big area. I block it off and then I ignore it because I know it's going to cause me so much angst and stress to mentally figure out how to make that happen. And it does impact the rest of my day. Like on days where I actually have a decent lunch, the rest of my afternoon seems very like relaxed and easygoing. But if I spend so much energy trying to figure out lunch and then I'm stressed when I go into my next meeting, it has an impact on the rest of my day. So sorry.
No, I think something that another like sort of this is at the base of most of the strategies we even talked about is just like something called if-then planning, which is a way that you have to do upfront work. There's no way around this. You have to do upfront work to like the pre-mortem or like the unpacking a task of like, and this can apply to several different things. Like for me, it's not a lunch thing, but it's like how to navigate like networking events. I've created a ton of if-then things for myself of how to like, instead of in the moment trying to figure out how to navigate, I've sort of decided ahead of time, if it's 10 p.m. and I'm still there, I'm going home. Does it matter who I'm talking to? No. Does it matter? Like nothing else matters because that's my if-then rule. So with some of these things that like can feel like very overwhelming in the moment, sometimes having these if-then plans ahead of time of like, if it's 12 and if it's 2 and I haven't eaten, I'm going to eat. If I have meat, chicken, and whatever, what was it? Cheese, grapes, and and
Okay.
fish in the fridge, that's what I'm eating. Or like, if this is, so like, that can help with some of these things where like you identify, this is my, like, the thing that like my decision gears like go out of control is like, remove the decision and also 100% remove the shame, remove the this, remove the that, and make it just a very I think the thing with these if then things is they make them very not morally weighty. It's just
Like a
if
rule of
then it
thumb.
happens, then that. There's no decision around it. There's no this, there's no that. It's the same with like other habits, like people who go to the gym in the morning. When they wake up, they go to the gym. There's no like, do I want to go to the gym? Right? They just like, if this, then that. But it does take work ahead of time, and sometimes the rule doesn't work, and you like, right, there's like some shifting in it, but that's also like, that's kind of at the base of a lot of these strategies, and then can be applied to other things.
No, I love that. I don't know if you've read the book, How to Clean When Drowning.
No.
I love that book. Highly recommend it. But she talks about pair tasks being morally neutral.
Yeah.
And so when you said that, I was like, no, that's entirely what it is. Like, this is one of those situations where I have to remind myself that like, it's to feed yourself is morally neutral.
Yeah.
Period.
I think that's at the, like, when you were saying that before, Stacey, I think that's like an underlying part of all of this, really. It's like giving yourself a little bit of grace. Like, right? That part is so hard with work. We judge ourselves so much. And I think it goes beyond like, did I eat? Did I not eat? But like, even in like, did I show up correctly for that meeting? Why am I tired right now when I should be doing work? Yada, yada, yada. And it's almost more of the self-blame and the like talk that ends up being so exhausting, and maybe not always like the work itself. Like sometimes it's all of the doubts and all the stuff that comes around it. And yeah, like that's the hardest part. But I think that, you know, maybe I don't have like a tool like Vivian's, like if then that, but I do think that there is something to kind of just like looking at the experience for what it is and realizing it just is. Like it is. That's it. There's nothing good or bad about it. There's nothing that says anything else about me. You know, it's just like mindfulness, right? Like I'm just perceiving it as it is, and that's fine. Like it just is. And I think that takes a lot of the other stuff that happens that really is in your mind.
And I have to say, one thing that you said, Vivian, that really stood out to me was I do manage up. My boss is like me in 20 years. And so, which is both again, a blessing and a challenge, because we are very, very similar and respond very similarly to things. But I too try to like manage folks engaging with her and vice versa, like her engaging with other folks, and whatnot. But I think that one of the things that you had said that I think is really important is that negativity aspect of it, right? Because we do run into, there's a lot that goes on, because above and beyond the work that you do as a nonprofit professional, there's also that internal politics of the work that you do. And so I try very hard to separate the two items. But what I've told my team is that there is no such thing as a administrative nonprofit emergency. Now, there may be emergencies with your folks that you're working with, but there is nothing that you are going to do administratively that is going to result in someone's life depending on it. And if it is at that point, like call 911, right? Like that is a true emergency. And so we try to use that with ourselves and with each other, to remind ourselves that like me not filing my expense report, golly, those things, is not going to result in the world coming to an end if I file it the next day. Now, I'm going to be more diligent in filing it the next day, but I don't have to get up at 1:00 in the morning when I remember that I have forgotten to file it, because nobody's going to process it at 1:05 a.m. So those are the types of things that like we try to remind ourselves, is like, is this a true emergency? As in, I need to engage a medical professional. Okay, then I think it's okay for you to like take a breather and step away.
Yeah.
I also loved that idea of identifying what stuff is actually critical, because no one wants to think that the work that they do isn't important. And there's a difference between importance and critical. Because like the work that you have to do, if you stop doing it forever, yeah, that's going to be a problem. But you can take a break for a week, and it doesn't mean your work's any less important. It just means that it's okay for you to step away, and you don't have to worry about somebody else having to take that role on. And that's definitely something that I think I will make sure to incorporate moving forward, around what's actually critical versus what is important, but is not necessarily time sensitive.
Yeah. All right. I'm sorry. I've just noticed the time. I need to make sure I'm getting stuff EVC needs from us. So we have a survey that we would love. I think it'll take you like 3 minutes to complete. So perhaps once we're done, Jeannie and I are done, you might even be able to finish it